For nearly 40 years, nobody lived at the old Whitfield farm. The house collapsed. The orchard disappeared. Eventually, even the road leading in was swallowed by the woods. But every autumn, the geese still came. They crossed the northern ridge heading south, reached the abandoned farm, and turned. Once. Twice. Sometimes 3 times. Then they continued south as though nothing had happened. It happened with different flocks, in different weather, even after most of the farm itself was gone. Nobody in the valley could explain it, but they knew exactly when it had started. The first autumn after the Whitfields left. And the Whitfields hadn't left because the farm failed. Thomas Whitfield bought the land in the spring of 1891. It wasn't much of a farm when he found it, a leaning barn, a house with a hole in the roof you could see stars through, a field gone to broom sedge, but it sat in a good bowl of a valley, with a spring-fed creek running along the eastern edge and a broad field behind the house that caught the last light of the day. Thomas was not a sentimental man, not by his own accounting. He worked, he fixed what needed fixing and some things that didn't. But his wife Clara turned the place into something worth coming home to. Flowers along the porch rail, a kettle that was never quite empty, a house that smelled like wood smoke and bread instead of dust. The first 2 years were mostly labor. Thomas rebuilt the barn board by board, salvaging what he could and hauling the rest to a burn pile that smoked for a week. Clara scrubbed 40 years of neglect out of the house 1 room at a time, and complained about none of it, at least not where Thomas could hear. In the evenings they sat on a porch that didn't yet have a proper rail and talked about what the place could be, once it stopped being a ruin and started being a farm. Their daughter Annie was born the second winter they were there, in a bedroom that still smelled faintly of the fresh-cut lumber Thomas had used to patch the wall. She grew up outdoors, muddy boots, scraped knees, always somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. She followed her father while he mended fence, handing him nails he hadn't asked for and asking questions he mostly didn't have answers to. She irritated her mother tracking creek mud across a floor just swept and never once seemed to notice she was doing it. A dog slept beneath the porch most of that first decade, and Annie treated it like a second shadow, the 2 of them turning up together at whatever corner of the farm had most recently gone quiet. And every autumn, starting from the time she was old enough to run, she had one particular fascination. Geese. She could hear them before either of her parents could, that far-off, ragged honking high above the ridge, and she'd drop whatever she was holding and run for the field. She'd stand out there with her face turned up and wave at them, both arms over her head, like she expected an answer. As she got older, waving from the field stopped being enough. She'd creep toward the creek at the field's edge, trying to keep the flock in sight a little longer before the tree line swallowed them. Thomas warned her more than once. The creek was the line, and past the creek was timber she didn't know, and he didn't want her in, ridge or no ridge, geese or no geese. Annie always said she understood. Mostly she stayed on the right side of the water. "They can't see you from up there," Thomas told her once. "They can too," Annie said. She was certain of it. One year, a flock did something unusual. It circled, once, maybe twice, before moving on. Thomas noticed, but didn't think much of it. Geese looking for water, maybe, or thrown off by the wind coming down off the ridge. Annie had her own explanation. "See," she said, "they saw me." Thomas smiled and let her have it. That evening, working by lamplight, he cut her a rough block of pine and handed her his pocket knife, showing her how to hold it without taking off a finger. Annie carved a goose, or tried to. It came out lopsided, one wing thicker than the other, the neck too short. "That's a fine duck," Thomas said, turning it over in his hands. "It's a goose," Annie said, offended, and made him say so until he did. He kept it on the mantel after that, then later in a drawer, and never once mentioned it again where she could hear. It was a small thing, a child's game with the sky, and a bad carving to go with it. Nobody thought anything more of it. Annie was 8. The autumn everything changed. An early cold front came hard across the mountains that year, days ahead of when anyone expected it. Annie was helping her mother in the kitchen when she heard the geese, faint at first, then closer, that same ragged calling she'd know anywhere. She was out the door before Clara could stop her. "Don't go far," Clara called after her, already knowing it was useless. Annie ran for the field the way she always did. The flock crossed low over the ridge, and instead of stopping at the creek the way she'd promised, Annie crossed it, following the sound past the water and into the timber beyond, chasing the last of calling before it faded into the trees. She didn't come back. Nobody panicked, not at first. Thomas checked the barn, the near side of the creek, the edge of the orchard, all the places she liked to disappear to. It wasn't until he reached the water and called across it and got nothing back that the ordinary kind of worry turned into something else. Neighbors were sent for. By the time the light started failing, men from 3 farms over were spreading out past the creek into timber none of them knew especially well in daylight, let alone in the dark. They searched through the night with lanterns, calling her name into timber that swallowed the sound whole. Sleet came in sometime after midnight, turning the ground slick and the search slower, erasing whatever tracks might have told them which way to look. Lantern light threw long shapes across ground already walked once, twice, that looked different every time. Thomas went back over stretches that had already been searched, as if looking harder might change what was there. Clara stayed on the porch through most of it, listening for a voice that wasn't Thomas's or a neighbor's, and heard nothing but the wind and the men calling back and forth to each other somewhere up the wooded slope. They found her at first light, beneath a big sycamore well up the slope past the creek, farther than she'd ever gone, farther than she'd been told to go. She had gotten turned around in the dark and the weather once the tree line closed over her, and the cold had done the rest. There was no mystery in it. No villain, no accident with a name attached, just a child who wandered too far in worsening weather and a family who would spend the rest of their lives carrying that. Thomas carried her home himself. The weeks after were the hardest kind of quiet, not dramatic, just relentless. Clara woke some mornings still moving toward the stove before she remembered there was no breakfast to make. Thomas started to call Annie's name once, from the porch, before he caught himself. Small things did the damage, large things couldn't. A cup by the wash basin nobody had the heart to move. A coat still on its peg. Thomas finally put her shoes away in a drawer. Clara took them back out the same week, and neither of them said anything about it. It was a ribbon that finally broke her, the one Annie wore running out to see the geese, found behind the dresser where it had slipped and been forgotten. Clara held it for a long time before she said what she'd apparently been carrying for weeks. "I can't grow old in this house." Thomas didn't argue. There wasn't an argument to make. By spring the farm had passed to Thomas's brother, and Thomas and Clara were gone from the valley, not fleeing exactly, but not staying either. Clara didn't look back as they drove out. Thomas did. It would be nearly 40 years before either of them saw the place again. The farm stood empty that first autumn without them, and a man working a neighboring field heard geese cross the ridge the way they always had. He watched the flock come on, expecting nothing. They reached the old Whitfield place and turned. Once, twice. Then they straightened out and continued south, same as any other year, except that they hadn't gone straight through. They'd circled first, right over the empty house, for no reason anyone standing in that field could name. He thought little of it until a second flock did the same thing, days later. Then he started paying attention. The next autumn, it happened again. Different geese, same behavior, cross the ridge, reach the farm, circle, leave. Someone in the valley made a joke about it. Something about the geese looking for that Whitfield girl, and nobody laughed much, but the remark stuck, the way things do in small valleys with long memories. Years went by. The house lost shingles, then whole sections of roof. The fence posts leaned and eventually gave up leaning and just fell. Apple trees that Clara had once kept pruned went wild and tangled, dropping fruit nobody gathered anymore. Twice a family tried to take up the place. bought it cheap, moved their belongings in, started the long work of fixing what the weather had ruined. Neither family lasted a full year. Nothing frightening ever happened to them, nothing anyone could point to and name. They just didn't stay, the way people sometimes leave a place without being able to say exactly why, only that it never quite felt like it wanted them there. A large section of the roof finally gave way sometime around the turn of the century, caving in over the front rooms after a hard winter, leaving the rest of the house standing but badly exposed. Some in the valley figured that would be enough to change things, a loss that prominent, surely the geese would notice. That autumn, when the first flock crossed the ridge, more than a few people walked out to watch, half expecting the birds to pass on by without so much as a dip. They circled anyway, same as always. Whatever they were turning for, it apparently wasn't the roof. But every autumn, the geese circled. Different residents of the valley came to know it as simply a fact of the place, the way you'd know a creek flooded in spring or a certain hollow held frost longer than the rest. Children grew up watching for it. Some claimed the geese circled exactly 3 times, always. Others insisted the number changed year to year. A few said only the lead flock did it, and the rest just followed on through. Others swore every flock that crossed that stretch of sky did the same thing, without exception. Nobody agreed on the specifics. Everyone agreed on the fact itself. People tried to explain it, the way people try to explain anything that unsettles them by making it ordinary. Water nearby, some said. Geese are drawn to water, and the creek still ran along the property even with the house falling in on itself. Others blamed the wind, some particular current thrown up by the shape of the ridge that only showed itself over that one field. A few of the older farmers talked about thermals, rising air off the valley floor, though nobody could say why it would rise only there and nowhere else along the same ridge line. One neighboring farmer, tired of the talk, deliberately scattered grain across his own field one autumn, hoping to prove the geese would turn for anyone with the right bait. They flew straight over him without so much as a dip in altitude, and circled the Whitfield place instead, same as always. Another year, the old field had grown up so thick with brush you could barely tell a house had ever stood there. The geese still circled it. Nobody ever proved anything. The explanations piled up and canceled each other out, and the valley mostly settled into treating the circling geese the same way they treated a bend in the road, a feature of the land, unremarkable except that it was strange, and strange except that it was so unremarkably consistent. Thomas and Clara built a life several counties away, not a replacement for what they'd lost, just a quieter continuation of living. Thomas found work with a lumber outfit. Clara took in sewing for families in town. They didn't have other children, though they never spoke of that as a decision, only as something that simply hadn't happened. They grew old together in a small house that neither of them ever tried to make into what the farm had been. Thomas died a little more than 2 decades after Annie, and in his last years he'd sometimes bring up the farm, careful and roundabout, testing whether Clara might be ready to hear it. She never was. He stopped asking after a while, not out of frustration, but because he understood, better than most husbands might have, that some doors weren't his to open on her behalf. After he died, Clara found it among his things, the same lopsided pine goose, one wing still thicker than the other, the neck still too short. He'd kept it in that drawer for over 20 years without ever once showing her or telling her he still had it. Clara kept it after that, in the same drawer, same as he had. Years later, a letter reached her. The old Whitfield land was finally going to be sold off, timbered or divided, the house likely torn down or left to finish falling on its own. An old neighbor, one of the last who remembered the family, added a line at the bottom: "If you ever mean to see it again, now would be the time." Clara was nearly 70. She told herself no, and meant it for almost a week. Then it occurred to her, turning the wooden goose over in her hand one evening, that she had spent nearly 40 years avoiding the place where her daughter died. She had not once let herself consider that she'd also been avoiding the place where her daughter had lived. That distinction, small as it was, changed her mind. She traveled back that autumn, The road in came back to her in pieces, a particular bend, a creek crossing, the shape of the ridge against the sky, recognition arriving slower than memory usually does, as if the land itself needed convincing she was really there. The house was barely standing. She walked through it anyway, careful of the floorboards, the door hanging half off its hinges the way doors do in houses nobody has closed properly in decades. Height marks were still visible on a doorframe, faded but there. 4 notches, the last one higher than the rest, the one Annie never got the chance to outgrow. A nail Thomas had driven still held a section of shelf. In what had been Annie's room, a scrap of blue paint clung on in one corner the weather hadn't reached, the same blue Clara remembered choosing at the Mercantile, back when choosing a paint color had been an ordinary, happy kind of decision. Clara realized, standing in that room, that she remembered laughter here more clearly than she remembered the last morning. That was not what she had expected to feel. She walked out past the house, toward the creek, and crossed it herself for the first time since the night they'd searched it by lantern light. The sycamore was still there on the far side, bigger now, its roots grown thick over the ground where they'd found her. Clara stood beneath it a long while and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the tree hadn't already heard. Then she turned back, not toward the house, toward the open field on the near side of the water, the one Annie had actually loved, the one she'd run to 100 times before she ever crossed that creek. The field was quiet. Then, faint at first, she heard it, that same ragged honking, high and thin, carrying down out of the north, the way it had every autumn of her daughter's short life. She looked up. A flock was crossing, dark against the gray sky, exactly the way they'd crossed 1,000 times when Annie was alive to see them. Clara stood very still and let the sound come closer, the way she hadn't let herself do in nearly 40 years. They reached the old farm and turned. Clara had never heard the local talk about the geese. In 40 years, she'd let no news of the Whitfield place reach her, and nobody who loved her had pushed it on her, not even Thomas, who might have known, and who never once told her if he did. So when it happened right above her, Clara wasn't watching for anything. She was simply watching. One circle. Then another. And Clara remembered. Not something she'd been told, not something she'd imagined, but remembered, clean and sudden. Annie standing in that same field, 8 years old, face turned up to the sky, both arms raised. Clara raised her hand, barely at first, then higher. She waved. The same foolish gesture her daughter had made 100 times, that Thomas had laughed at, that Clara herself had never once joined in on, while Annie was alive to see it. The flock completed one more slow circle overhead. Then it straightened and moved on south, and Clara stood in the field and watched until she couldn't find them against the sky anymore. For the first time in nearly 40 years, she let herself remember Annie alive, instead of the last morning she'd seen her. Clara didn't stay. That was never going to be the ending. The farm was too far gone, and so was the life she'd have needed to come back to it. She visited the small country cemetery where Annie was buried, spent one more night nearby, and left the next morning. This time, though, she looked back. 40 years earlier she had refused to. Thomas had been the one to turn around in the wagon seat for a last look at the place they were leaving. This time, it was Clara. She died several years later, in the quieter life she and Thomas had built. The old farmhouse finished collapsing not long after her last visit. The barn went the same way not many years after that. Trees came up through what had been the field, and eventually there was almost nothing left standing to tell a stranger a farm had ever been there at all. Which raises the only question nobody in the valley has ever been able to answer. If the geese were circling a house, a structure, a landmark, some feature of the land tied to where people once lived, what happens when the house is gone? Years after the last board had rotted into the ground, someone who still remembered the story took a younger relative through that stretch of valley one autumn afternoon. There was no house left to point to, no barn, barely enough clearing left to call it a field. They stopped anyway, more or less where the old place had stood. Then they heard it, That same far-off honking, drifting down off the ridge the way it had for longer than anyone standing there had been alive. A flock crossed low, dark against the sky, and reached the empty clearing. It turned over the trees where a house used to be. One broad circle. A second, tighter than the first. And then the birds leveled out and pressed on south, the same as they always had. "Why do they do that?" the younger one asked. The older one didn't have an answer. Nobody in that valley ever had. Some said it was water, or wind, or a thermal rising off the valley floor that only showed itself in that one place. Some said geese remember landmarks longer than people give them credit for, that the shape of a farm might outlast the farm itself in whatever passes for a goose's memory, generation after generation, long past the point any single bird could actually recall it. A few of the old-timers, the ones who still told it the way it had first been told to them, said it had started the autumn after a little girl stopped running into that field to wave at them and left it there without saying anything more. None of it was ever proven. None of it ever fully explained why that field, and no other, held on to whatever it was the geese kept coming back to find. The house is gone. The barn is gone. The family is gone. Every autumn, something still turns over that empty ground,